You killed me. It took me a long time, but you of all people know.
Police confirmed the phone line was cut. The infrastructure didn't exist. There was no way for it to ring. And yet, 4 children said it did. 4 children who had never met, who had never compared notes, who had been held separately across different years in a soundproofed basement with no windows, no light except a single bulb screwed into the ceiling, and no connection to the outside world. 4 children who all described the same phone, the same ring, the same voice on the other end of a line that was connected to nothing. And 3 of those 4 children are alive today. Before we go any further, a necessary acknowledgement. What you are about to hear is constructed from multiple real case files, documented survivor testimonies, and investigative records, some of which remain partially sealed. Certain details have been altered or dramatized to protect identities and to serve the integrity of the narrative. This is not a documentary. It is not fiction. It lives in the space between those two things, which is coincidentally where the most disturbing true stories always live. Now, let me tell you what the file actually says. It's 1977. The American Midwest. A suburb that looks exactly like 10,000 other suburbs. Screen doors, sprinklers on Sunday mornings, kids building ramps from plywood in empty lots. The kind of place where nothing ever happens. Until it did. The first boy vanished on a Tuesday afternoon in late August. 12 years old. He had ridden his bicycle toward a friend's house 4 blocks away. The bicycle was found 2 days later, half buried in a hedgerow at the edge of a vacant lot. The front wheel was still slowly turning when the postal worker spotted it, as if it had been dropped there moments before. The boy was not found. 6 weeks later, a girl, 10 years old, walked to the corner store 3 minutes from her house and never came back. The store owner remembered her. He remembered what she bought. He remembered the door closing behind her. After that, nothing. Then a 3rd child, a 4th, a 5th. 14 months, 5 families, 0 arrests. This was, broadly, the same pattern that investigators would later document in connection with abduction clusters throughout the late 1970s, a period that criminologists now acknowledge was the deadliest decade of child abductions in American history. The same years that produced John Wayne Gacy in Chicago, Dean Corll in Houston, names that became synonymous with a specific terrible kind of failure, the failure of ordinary communities to see what was operating directly inside them. The town changed, slowly at first, then all at once. Doors that had never been locked were locked. Children driven distances that could be walked in 90 seconds. The sounds of ordinary life pulling inward, contracting, tightening around itself like a fist. And through every press conference, every carefully worded police statement, every community meeting under fluorescent lights in a church hall, one detail was never mentioned. Because it made no sense. And when you are trying to reassure a terrified community, the last thing you want to introduce is something you cannot explain. So they said nothing. And the phone in the basement that most of them didn't know existed kept ringing.
He had no name, not yet. In the neighborhood, they called him what they saw, the man in the van, which sounds almost darkly comic until you hear it described by someone who actually saw it, and then it doesn't sound like anything comic at all. The van was black, old, one of those large, boxy American models from the early 1970s that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No visible rear windows, license plate consistently obscured, mud, according to some witnesses, something deliberate, according to others. It moved slowly. That was the detail that witnesses kept returning to, unprompted, years apart from each other, having never compared notes. It never rushed, never idled loudly. It simply moved. Through the neighborhood, past the park, past the school, like something that had been circling for a long time and intended to keep circling. 16 separate sightings were documented in the 14 months between the first and fifth disappearances. Officers were dispatched to investigate 3 of them. None resulted in a contact or identification. But there was one witness, a 17-year-old girl, who had seen the van slow and stop at the end of her street on 2 separate evenings, who described something that appeared in the interview transcripts and was circled by investigators, and then never followed up. She said the driver smiled at her through the windshield, patient, still, the smile of a man who had already decided something and was in absolutely no hurry about it. She said the smile was the worst part, not the van, not the slowness, the smile. But there was something else, something she mentioned toward the end of her second interview that was recorded, transcribed, and then, for reasons that remain unclear, never incorporated into the official summary. She said that the second time she saw the van stop at the end of her street, she stood at her window and watched it for several minutes before it moved on. And she said that while she was watching it, she heard a phone ringing from inside the van. Not a car phone, those barely existed in 1977, and certainly not in a vehicle like that. A different kind of ring, older, mechanical, the kind that carries. She said she assumed she had imagined it. She said she never stopped assuming that.
The walls were lined with acoustic insulation, dense, industrial grade, the kind used in recording studios, designed not to muffle sound, but to erase it entirely, to create a space where whatever happened inside stayed inside, completely and permanently. The windows were sealed, not boarded, sealed, the frames filled with a hardening compound that became part of the wall itself, as if whoever had done it wanted to eliminate even the idea of an opening. One bulb, ceiling mounted, on a switch at the top of the stairs. No natural light, no sense of time, no sound from the world above. And on the north wall, mounted at the height a standing adult would use it, a telephone. Black, rotary dial, mid-1960s manufacture, the kind built to last decades, the kind that weighs like a brick and rings loud enough to be heard from 2 rooms away. The cord that should have connected it to the wall jack was cut, not frayed, not worn through with age, cut cleanly, with something sharp, with intention. There was no active telephone line in the basement. There had never been an active telephone line in the basement, confirmed by the regional telephone company, confirmed again by a private infrastructure assessment conducted years later when the case was quietly reopened. The phone was not connected to anything. It could not receive a call. It could not make a call. It was, by every measurable definition, a non-functional object. But here is the detail that the investigators noted in their report and then did not discuss publicly. Here is the detail that when I first read it, I made me put the file down and sit with it for a long time before I could continue. In the dust beneath the phone, on the floor directly below where the receiver hung, there were fingerprints. Not one set, multiple sets, overlapping each other, layer upon layer, the way fingerprints accumulate when many different hands touch the same surface across an extended period of time, as if different children across different years had all reached for the same receiver. The phone was not connected to anything, and children kept picking it up. The boy I will call M was 11 years old. He was held for approximately 4 to 5 days. He survived. I want to say that clearly and early because it matters for everything that follows. In his initial statement, conducted across 2 sessions with a child psychologist present, M described hearing the phone ring multiple times across his captivity. He described picking it up because the ringing was the only sound in the room that wasn't the sound of his own breathing. And he needed, desperately, physically needed to hear something else. The investigators asked him to describe the voice. M closed his eyes. He pressed his hands flat against his thighs. He sat with the question for a long time. Then he opened his eyes and said, "It sounded like a kid, but not a kid who was okay." The investigators asked what the voice said. M said it knew his name. Said it without asking, the way you say the name of someone you've known your whole life, not as a greeting, not as a question, as a fact. As the starting point of a conversation the voice had clearly been waiting to have. Then it said it was sorry it couldn't do more. Then it said to listen to everything, even to the things that didn't sound like anything. The investigators wrote this down. Then they moved on to other questions because they had other questions to ask, and the phone was impossible. And impossible things tend to get written down and then quietly set aside. But near the end of the second session, as M was preparing to leave, as the psychologist was capping her pen, as the recording was still running, M said he needed to say one more thing about the voice. Something he hadn't mentioned yet because he hadn't been sure, and then he had been sure, but he hadn't known how to say it. The voice didn't just know his name, it used a nickname, a specific nickname that his family didn't use, that wasn't in any report, any school record, any document the investigators had access to. A nickname that existed in exactly one place in M's life, between him and his older brother. The investigators asked about the brother. M said his brother had been dead for 3 years. The investigators wrote this down, and then they closed the folder. because there are things a case file is not built to hold. M was not the only one. 3 other survivors came forward across the years that followed. Children who had been held in that basement or in spaces so precisely similar in their construction that the detective working the case independently considered them the work of the same deliberate hand. Each remembered the phone. Each described picking it up. But the calls were not the same. The first survivor after M, a girl, 13 at the time, described a voice that was angry, not at her, at the situation, at the walls and the sealed windows and the cut cord and all the things that should not have been, but were. She described it as the anger of someone who had been patient for a very long time and was reaching the end of that patience. The voice gave her specific, precise, almost tactical information. Which step on the stairs would hold her wait silently, how long to wait before attempting it, what she would find at the top. Delivered with the clipped urgency of a soldier relaying intelligence under fire. She waited. She tried. She reached the top. The second survivor described a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Exhausted was the word they used years later, trying to find language for it. Not tired, the deeper kind, the kind that accumulates in a person who has been expending something finite and cannot stop expending it. This voice told the survivor to study the light, not the bulb, the light on the floor, the way shadows moved during certain hours. It said, there is someone on the other side of that wall who comes at a predictable time. Learn the light, learn the rhythm. When the shadow comes, make noise. Not your voice, that won't carry. Something rhythmic, something that repeats. The survivor found a loose piece of bracket near the phone mount, knocked it against the north wall 47 times by their own careful count. A neighbor heard something indistinct, mentioned it in passing. An officer followed up 3 days later. The third call, the fourth child chronologically, was described as calm, almost clinical, like someone reading from a list compiled at great cost and delivered now with the precision of someone who would not get another chance to deliver it. No urgency, no visible emotion, just information in the sequence it would need to be used. All of it accurate, all of it unknowable, all of it, in some measure, the difference between a child who came home and a child who did not. The detective who compiled these accounts spent 11 years working the case on his own time after his retirement. His own hours, his own resources, the kind of sustained private obsession that either indicates a broken man or a man who has seen something that simply will not let go. He was not a credulous person. He had worked homicides for 30 decades. He had learned to distrust sentiment, wishful thinking, and the very human hunger for meaning in the middle of senseless things. He said explicitly in the only recorded interview he has given, "I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in evidence, and the evidence told me that 4 children across different years with 0 contact with each other, with no exposure to each other's testimonies, described the same phone in the same location, receiving calls from a source that should not be able to call, with information that was accurate, actionable, In several cases, the direct reason they are alive. I don't know what to call that. I only know what the file says. He mapped the accounts against the outcomes. Every child who reported the phone, who described picking it up, hearing a voice, receiving information, survived. No survivor failed to mention the phone. He did not state a conclusion in his written summary. He was too careful for conclusions. What he wrote in the final pages was this: the information conveyed was accurate, actionable, and unknowable to the recipients through any conventional means. I have no conventional explanation for its source. I have recorded the accounts faithfully and leave interpretation to whoever reads this after me. 6 months after writing that, he retired. He has not spoken about the case since. The case loosely resembles elements of child abduction patterns documented across the Midwest and Upper South throughout the late 1970s. Patterns that a 1983 regional law enforcement briefing later classified and only partially released under Freedom of Information requests, described as showing unusual consistency in methodology across non-connected incidents. That briefing referenced in a single footnote, one footnote in a classified document buried where almost no one would look, anomalous witness testimony regarding communication devices in secondary containment spaces. Someone in 1983 knew about the phones and buried the knowledge in a footnote. When investigators eventually cross-referenced the full set of accounts, years after the case files were formally closed, they found something in the original archive, in the files from the earliest years of the investigation, before the case was sealed, before anyone had found a survivor, before anyone had publicly reported anything about the phone. A single handwritten note, stapled to the inside back cover of a manila folder, written in the handwriting of a detective who had since died. The note read, "Ask them about the phone." It was undated. Forensic analysis of the ink placed its composition with reasonable confidence at approximately 2 years before the first survivor was ever recovered. 2 years before any child had been found. 2 years before any testimony about the phone existed in any form. 2 years before the story that note appeared to anticipate had technically happened yet. That detective wrote those 5 words 2 years too early, and no one has ever explained how. The journalist who found the note eventually dropped the story entirely. When asked why, she said, through a colleague having declined all direct contact, that there were parts of the case she had become convinced were not hers to tell. She has not elaborated. She has asked not to be contacted. The case loosely resembles elements of child abduction patterns documented across the Midwest and Upper South throughout the late 1970s. Patterns that a 1983 regional law enforcement briefing later classified and only partially released under Freedom of Information requests, described as showing unusual consistency in methodology across non-connected incidents. That briefing referenced in a single footnote, one footnote in a classified document, buried where almost no one would look, an anomalous witness testimony regarding communication devices in secondary containment spaces. Someone in 1983 knew about the phones and buried the knowledge in a footnote. When investigators eventually cross-referenced the full set of accounts, years after the case files were formally closed, they found something in the original archive. In the files from the earliest years of the investigation, before the case was sealed, before anyone had found a survivor, before anyone had publicly reported anything about the phone. A single handwritten note stapled to the inside back cover of a manila folder, written in the handwriting of a detective who had since died. The note read, "Ask them about the phone." It was undated. Forensic analysis of the ink placed its composition with reasonable confidence at approximately 2 years before the first survivor was ever recovered, 2 years before any child had been found, 2 years before any testimony about the phone existed in any form, 2 years before the story that note appeared to anticipate had technically happened yet. That detective wrote those 5 words 2 years too early, and no one has ever explained why. The journalist who found the note eventually dropped the story entirely. When asked why, she said, through a colleague having declined all direct contact, that there were parts of the case she had become convinced were not hers to tell. She has not elaborated. She has asked not to be contacted. The detective's note was written 2 years before it should have existed. The phone had no line, no power, no connection. The children who answered it came home. The ones who didn't, we don't know what they heard. If you believe the phone was real, if those 2 words have been sitting in your chest since the moment I said them, comment, "and yet." If you think there's a rational explanation for every single thing in this case, tell me exactly what it is. I will read every one, because maybe someone out there has the answer. Or maybe, and this is what I actually believe, the answer is the part of this story that no file was ever going to hold. Subscribe. There are more cases like this one, cases where the official record and the human record refuse to align, where something happened that the paperwork simply could not contain. We are just getting started.